Well, welcome viewers to the Razor Sharp program, midweek Razor Sharp review. My name's Sharon Farbres. I've got with me right here Jeannie Rea, and she's the president of the NTEU, which is the National Tertiary Education Union. And on my right is Dr. Ken Coghill from Monash University, specialising in governance. Very important. You're both in very important roles, and I think roles that I think are very important to us at the moment as we're looking at an impending election. So we've got the federal election looming. I'll ask you, Jeannie, we've got the federal election looming, and yet we've got a government that really appears to be in enormous disunity. We've got the, we've got Turnbull, Rudd, Turnbull. Not Turnbull, Rudd, but we had Rudd, Gillard, yes. But we've certainly got Turnbull, Abbott, Turnbull, but it's interchangeable as well. But how does that appear in terms of confusion, calamity? Is this a government or a party that really does seem to have the assurance of the public at large that they've got sound management and got sound policies for the future?
Look, I think what's going on at the moment within the Liberal Party and across the coalition is shameful, as it was shameful when we had a Labor government in disarray. We have a Liberal National Party government in disarray at the moment, where they're more concerned about their own jobs, their own futures, and they're not showing much concern at all for the Australian people who did vote for them and did have expectations of them. And of course we know that their history since they've been in government has been one of broken promises. So even where they promised things to the people who did vote for them, they haven't fulfilled those either. But I think the whole trajectory of their time in government's been absolutely appalling. And I think probably the most obvious thing now is that we've seen no change since it's gone from Abbott to Turnbull. There was great expectations that Turnbull was going to be better in lots of ways. Well, he's not as rabid as Tony Abbott, but that's about as far as we can take it. Clearly, any of the more progressive social agenda that he may be prepared to pursue, he's not prepared to, because he wants to hold on to the leadership. And that's what I mean by, Sharon, that they're more concerned about themselves and what they're supposed to be there for, which is representing the interests of the people who vote for them, and hopefully having some understanding of what the whole country is after, trying to get some sort of consensus. But they're not. They're divisive amongst themselves, and they're divisive for the country. Turnbull hasn't introduced new policies. They're the same old Abbott policies. If I just look to our sector in higher education, we're today calling upon Senator Birmingham, the Minister for Education, who replaced Christopher Pyne, who is pretty notorious and you will remember as the fixer. Fortunately, he didn't fix up education, and now he's making a mess of science and innovation. But what we're calling upon Senator Birmingham today to do is actually clarify what is on the table and what is off the table on higher education. At the moment, twice has the Senate voted down their policy of huge cuts, 20% cuts to funding to universities, the full deregulation of undergraduate domestic fees, and of course the handover of public monies to private, including for-profit providers in higher education. And that's still their policy. That's still what we know they're interested in. That's where the ideological commitment is about handing over public money to private companies. And yet at the same time, they're outraged at as what's happened in VET, in the vocational education and training sector, where, surprise, surprise, they call it unintended consequences. I'd say perfectly predictable outcomes of a whole lot of companies. I won't give them the respect of saying that they're educational institutions at all, but a whole lot of companies were just out to make a quick buck, got in, ripped millions and millions. I don't think people fathom quite how much money they've ripped off from the government, public money, our money, and at the same time left students in appalling levels of debt. So, and these companies have just preyed upon the most disadvantaged, the most vulnerable, and put them in debt. So what they've done is criminal on many levels, criminal in terms of the stealing of public money, and then criminal in actually preying upon the people who are in the most vulnerable positions in our communities. It's just appalling, and that, of course, has included in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities.
Yes, precisely. I mean, as we're seeing that we're all being impacted and affected here. And, Ken, I mean, let's look at it, from your perspective. I mean, the policies that they're looking at, I mean, it's a user pay policy system for corporations to benefit, from a governance perspective here. That seems to be kicking in. And that's where we're seeing the user pay doctrines and theories as contrary to democracy. This is it's created a war zone, has it not? A little bit of what you've explained here, Jeannie, is this now the corporate approach, the corporate methodology is better than the public methodology. We've had no notice, no data or detail given to us, no preliminary discussions, but we've had systems that imposed upon us, and this is what this Conservative government has been well known and renowned for, and become and known as extreme right wing.
Well, I think we can trace it back right to the election of the Abbott government, where they said that they were going to support things like the NDIS, they were going to support the Gonski reforms to education, and they were basically going to maintain all of the Labor programs and somehow or other reconcile that with their desire to cut taxes and all the rest of it. What we've seen since then is chaos under Abbott. He ran a chaotic office, and that's been clarified and confirmed by Nikki Sava's recent book, Road to Ruin.
Yes.
And what we're seeing now with Turnbull, as Jeannie has said, is a continuation of the Abbott policies, but they have a smile on their face. It's Abbott.
Maybe more a grimace by this stage.
Well, it's certainly started as a smile on Turnbull's face, but what we're seeing is a downward spiral. Turnbull started off, for example, in the tax area, saying everything's on the table, and what we've seen is a progressive statement saying, well, that's not on the table any longer, and that's not on the table any longer, and we're not going to increase the GST. And when it comes to negative gearing, Labor has said they're going to do something, so we're not going to do that. And when it came to the capital gains tax, they said, well, Labor's going to do that, so we won't do that. When you look at the things that they have in fact taken off the table, they are virtually all things where there would be some cost to the people who support liberal values, the people who have the highest incomes, the greatest power in society. They are the ones who are going to be spared the tax increases or the withdrawal of tax concessions as Turnbull goes on to try and put together a budget over the next few weeks. Now,
Yes.
in trying to put together a budget, he's got enormous troubles because of the divisions within his own coalition, both within the Liberal Party and between the Liberal Party and the National Party. But he's also got a treasurer who is looking increasingly incompetent. And certainly what I hear is that reflects his own office. It's not the sort of office that you would expect a treasurer to have, knowing that he's got to make important decisions for the long term. Rather, it's an office that a State Secretary of the Liberal Party might have, which is where he came from, where he's basically running a political tactics office rather than trying to make the best possible plans for the future of Australia. Now, Malcolm Turnbull has pulled him into line over quite a few things recently, and the fact that he's had to do that just demonstrates the division within the Liberal Party, because clearly if Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison were talking to each other, there wouldn't be these differences of opinion arising, and so there wouldn't be cases where Turnbull has had to countermand some of the statements that Scott Morrison has made. So what we're seeing is a downward spiral where Turnbull is cutting off all of his options, so it's making it a tighter and tighter spiral. And when it comes to the budget, 10th of May or whenever it happens to be, you'll find that there are very few decisions that he's been able to make, and so he won't be able to take a credible policy to the people whether the election is on the 2nd of July or whether it's later in the year.
So, I mean, obviously this is where the concerns are. I mean, with the Turnbull government, I mean, we've got, and Abbott as well, we're dealing with secrecy in terms of governance, and on the table, off the table, I mean, we're leading into a federal election in 2016 and a budget as well in May. So, I mean, there should be a lot of discussion, a lot more than what we've been having at the moment. But would you not think that it's because the policies that are actually sitting on the table are the policies which the Liberal National Conservative Party actually run with, and of course those policies are the policies of the corporations. So, as you said, Ken, I mean, really the policies, if they were summarised, are policies really for the rich, where you've got perhaps the top 1% that have got getting the greater benefit out of all the wealth that's being created here in Australia. Or you might say the top 20% have more wealth than the bottom 80%. So, we're seeing this polarisation of wealth. We're seeing something like 2.5 million people in poverty generally. And as we see that poverty growing, we're seeing, and joblessness growing as well, employment opportunities and conditions as well. We're seeing that the marginalisation is expanding and increasing. And of course then we're seeing that the great wealth is being pocketed by the rich and pocketed by the corporations. The very points that you made. In education, we're seeing the education budget being sliced up, and we're seeing that now it's a user pay system that's being introduced by corporations. So it's a system of governance, government which has got governance within it, that has now moved us from democratic practice and intergenerational practices of the past, and a stable government from 1901, from the time of Federation. We've had all those years of a stable government. Now from Mr. Howard's time on, we've just post him, we've found destabilisation of government. And then we've found now, hence the policies are on the table that actually aren't on the table, but which the Turnbull government stand for, are policies for the rich to get richer, and then of course for the poor to get poorer. So we're stuck in the policies. But how would you? Just your response to that?
I think what is really clear about the current government is how ideologically driven they are. And so those notions of trying to achieve some sort of consensus, and part of the parliamentary process that we have is one about debate, about actually looking over things, the whole role of the Senate. I always was actually with Paul Keating on the Senate and the unrepresentative swill, but I've come to actually appreciate the Senate a whole lot more, particularly and bizarrely for someone who's right into democracy like me, come to appreciate that those real outlier characters that have got into the Senate are actually more representative of the people that are being disenfranchised that you're talking about, Sharon. So we actually had amongst those that have been supporting it, the rights to higher education of ordinary people by voting down twice the legislation that we were campaigning against. And they've included the likes of Senator Lazarus and Muir and Lambie, people who come from a working class background, haven't forgotten what it was like to actually have someone in Parliament as Ricky Muir to get up and say, well, this is what it's like living on the dole, having a family. Glenn Lazarus saying to us, well, I know this. My father couldn't afford to send us to university. I've been fortunate in my career through sport, but when I look at other members of my family, $100,000 degrees, well, that puts us ordinary folk right out of this. Senator Muir, now I've seen how other people live. Why aren't people like us able to live like this? Why can't my kids look at going to university or even finish school? Because, of course, out in regional Australia, even finishing school's still a battle, which is a point of the absolute fundamental importance of the Gonski reforms, which are about actually wherever you live in Australia, you still have an opportunity. So I think they're very ideologically driven. And, of course, the one which really shows that, of course, is their industrial relations. Policies, of course, where there's no difference between Abbott and Turnbull whatsoever. And so the absolutely outrageous Trade Union Royal Commission that was set up to look at corruption in the trade unions. And I know from the very beginning that people saying to me who weren't, in part of the unions, they'll say, I don't get it. Who are the unions being corrupt with? Where are the companies in this? Yeah, well, if there's
Yeah.
deals and stuff going on, well, what about the companies? Why aren't they being prosecuted? Instead, you had...
And the property developers, and of course,
Well,
those that are developing the skyscrapers in Melbourne and around all the landscape cities of
instead you had
Australia.
You had various company characters giving evidence to show, yes, there was some dodgy deal made with a union, which of course we thoroughly oppose, and everyone in the trade union movement, I think, who was shocked and horrified to find that there were some union officials that had made deals with employers for the benefit of not the members, and with some sort of things which we think are absolutely disgraceful and no part of a democratic and accountable trade union movement. But let's look at what came out of the Trade Union Royal Commission. They went on and on and on, millions and millions of dollars went on.
It was about $80 million.
Yeah, and heaps
taxpayer funds
of headlines. The guy running the show, Dyson Hayden, sort of spent having to be distracted from his mission to doing the trade unions to say, no, look, I'm not just an apparatchik of the Liberal Party, but failing to do that. But then nobody seemed to care a whole lot about that either. And then they come up with the outcome of it. So remember, it was meant to be looking at corruption in trade unions. And what are the recommendations at the end of it? Well, there were very few counts of anything that needed to be dealt with, and are all that you can deal with them all under the criminal law anyway.
Yes.
And should be dealt with, of course. But what are the recommendations? They're all things which are largely already contained within the Registered Organisations Bill, another thing which the Senate is refusing to pass. Then they're the things about restricting the right of entry of trade union officials.
Yes.
Basically, they're trying to promote a debate about that trade union officials, trade union members, shouldn't be allowed to encourage their co-workers to join a union.
Well, I mean, that's anti-constitutional, though.
That's pretty fundamental, isn't it?
Well, I mean, we'd have to say it's almost corrupt. Yeah. Because, I mean, when you, Ken, let's look at it. I mean, the thing is that, I mean, the unions are part of the fabric of society. If you look at the democratic structure we're under, we have the executive government, we have the judiciary. And we have our independent public broadcaster, which is the ABC, and we have unions that represented and have represented the nation for hundreds of years. Now, this is common law practice in this country. So why would we deviate from that? Other than the big problem has always been that the Turnbull government, or the Howard government, Abbott government, now Turnbull, has always been about putting the big corporate policies on the table. This is obviously a big policy thrust and push of the corporations so they can get richer and make greater profit off the back of workers. We're talking about 10 million workers here that need to have protection of wages, and they need to have protections of conditions. So,
well, I think it's very pertinent to that is that whilst this same government and their mates like going on about how fewer people are in trade unions than were in the past, which is a damn shame because people need their unions more than ever, at the same time, 2/3 of workers are, of course, covered by the enterprise agreements or awards negotiated by unions. So, in effect, they're getting a free pass by not joining their unions, which is also annoying. But the very point is that what this government's out to do is to actually strip away any protection, any advocates, any legal advocates for workers. Because it's those enterprise agreements and awards which are the only things between workers in this country and the abject and absolutely appalling conditions in countries which the very same people would condemn as totalitarian.
Yes, well, the dictatorships of other nations have been almost acting criminally and squashing the workers. I mean, they've been living in slumsville conditions and in sweatshop conditions. So, therefore, obviously, this is a top end of town. This is a big corporate policy push because they want to have a cheaper workforce. But as soon as what's happening is that they privatise the assets of this country as they buy it with the checkbook, and then they offshore it anyways. So they're offshoring our public assets for that very reason.
Well, it's quite ironic that this week you've got the Business Council of Australia coming out with their proposals for reform of taxation and what have you, at the very same time as two of their biggest members, Commonwealth Bank through CommInsure and ANZ through their interest rate swap deals that are now before the courts, charges laid there by ASIC, two of the biggest members of the Business Council of Australia are in fact shown to be or at least alleged, I've got to be careful here about the court processes, are alleged to have made major breaches of their legal duty, but even more than their legal duty, their duty of care to their customers, whether they be bank customers or insurance company customers. So here we have this dramatic illustration of the reality of what's being pushed by big business, as distinct from their claims to be speaking in the public interest.
Yes, so I mean the public interest is a big issue given the fact that we're in election mode. But I mean, as we're seeing that, these corporations, and in this case banks, not to forget we privatised our banks, thinking whether we're going to get a better deal. We had banks that were operating with making $10 billion profits here in this state and at the national level. The privatisation really opened the door to these corporations to be able to get traction and foot into owning and controlling very key strategic monetary concerns of the state. So therefore we were talking about, as we're saying, the insurance company belonging to the Commonwealth Bank and the ANZ Bank and their corrupt behaviour. So let's look at it. Corruption, why is the focus on the union movement? Why are they focusing on union heads, union organisations? That within itself is extreme right. And the falsification, the appearance of falsification of evidence, I think, and the claims that unions have made in terms of being singled out, etc. And at the same time, here's the government totally ignoring, the banks, the ANZ Bank in this instance, and also to the Commonwealth Bank, and not to forget to the Commonwealth Bank's roasting over their inordinate conduct
on
the financial advisors. So that still sits out there. That still needs to be subjected to an investigation. That needs a Royal Commission investigation. And not to forget too, all the conflict of interest by all those that are corporates or corporations now, and even politicians now that have interests in businesses. And we can only cite the two Liberal Party members from West Australia at the moment, Griggs and the other representative, that now have interest in using taxpayer funds to actually and have family members join them on trips to key places, but whereby they've got interests, they've got their own financial and business interests. For example, Poland and a trip to Europe was certainly being abused, you'd say, by a Liberal Party member. So you're seeing that, in other words, you're seeing a lot of abuse by corporations. You're seeing abuse at the government level.
I think where this is leading us is the contrast between the government's proposal to re-establish the ABCC and the Senate committee inquiry looking to an Australia-wide anti-corruption body. And we've only got to look at the evidence that's uncovered time and time again in New South Wales by ICAC, the things that have been uncovered in Victoria by the new IBAC here in Victoria, things that have been turned up in terms of corruption in Queensland, and again in the other states as well. That's the area where there needs to be a Commonwealth body that can be as effective in tackling corruption as ICAC is in New South Wales. If the government was really serious about tackling corruption wherever it occurs, they would be backing this Senate committee inquiry, which is looking into the possibility of a national anti-corruption body, and they would be abandoning their ABCC legislation, because it really deals with only a tiny minority of cases. And we know from Justice Hayden's report that in fact there was a tiny fraction of people working even in the construction industry who were behaving in a way which was unethical or improper or illegal. So far from the claim that is in his report that this is a widespread culture of malpractice, in fact it was malpractice by a small minority of people who do not have the support of their union colleagues.
Yeah, so I mean the widespread malpractice seems to be coming really from the bankers, the banking industry, the financial industry, and they've only really ended up with a rap across the knuckles. They haven't been subjected to an incriminating Royal Commission. It's mud throwing. Let's look at it. I mean, we are heading into a Royal Commission. They needed to have some means of clawing back position and status in the polls, given Mr Abbott's demise, and of course the potential loss there of 7.5% in the polls, which equated to I think 36 seats, which meant that in the election you only need 15 seats to win government. It would have been a mass landslide. So what are we saying here? I mean, obviously there's corruption. The focus it's who's driving the agenda, is it not? I mean, this is a business-driven agenda with political motives. Let's look at it. I mean, we've got the Liberal National Conservative government that's attacking crossbenchers and then also 2 unions. And what does that mean? There's an attempt to minimise the numbers of unionists that are in Parliament, particularly in the Legislative Assembly at the national level, because we've got a sizable representation there, and also too with crossbenchers and those that are independents in our federal Parliament. In other words, to really be major party centric in the country, and it's and to eliminate these other players. I mean, this is big business attempting to really, in a major sense, attempting to control the agenda and attempting to control outcomes, and these are political outcomes. So the political outcome of the Royal Commission, it was a politically driven Royal Commission. And Mr Dyson was seen himself to be involved in the Liberal Party, which really would have cancelled out his attendance any further to preside over the investigation, but he stayed on. That within itself has brought enormous incriminations and also attack, you'd say, against the Liberal National Conservative government, that obviously this Royal Commission is seen to have no worth at all. And we're seeing that, again, it's a policy that's being driven by the top end of town, an attempt to move labour from the labouring people, the wealth from the labouring people, into the pockets of the rich.
Look, I think the damage of the Royal Commission was done in having the Royal Commission, because and I think the very point of it was, of course, to discredit trade unions. To discredit trade unions, as I said, at the same time as saying trade unions are no longer relevant, the reality being that trade unions are going about doing their job, which is representing the interests of working people, whether they're actually members or not. Of course, the public that's not the rich few that you're talking about, Sharon, the public have enormous expectations and faith in trade unions to actually represent the interests of ordinary people, much beyond those that are members or eligible for membership. So, and that's what they're after crushing. They're after crushing voices which have credibility in the community. And so the unions, of course, were obviously the ones to come and focus upon there, because what the trade union movement has is members, is democratic. People do elect the leaders of trade unions, and they do kick them out if they find them to be no good. And unions have resources, and they're independent, because those resources are the membership fees. So that's why unions matter and are powerful, and why other parts of civil society rely on the trade unions. And that's also why the Liberal National Party coalition and their cronies want to smash them. So the job that they've done on discrediting unions is in many ways a lot more tragic than whatever legislation they may or may not be able to get up in the end. We've already got a fairly restricted environment within which we wage industrial negotiations in this country. I mean, if we had our brothers, the Fair Work Act would actually be a lot more, I suppose, pro-worker side of it, because at the moment, remember, even in the Fair Work Act put in by the Labor government, there's no right to strike. You can only go and take industrial action in this country when you're in bargaining, otherwise it's illegal. That's considered fairly unusual on a world stage. Usually workers can actually go on strike, but if you're in a union, that'll be illegal. Actually, if you're not in a union, you could interesting.
Go on strike.
Interesting. Yeah. Something I've encouraged with, I'd have to say, with young people trying to deal with some of the poor employers they have in hospitality and so on. Say, just go and picket them. Say what they said. Yeah.
But anyway, the ILO.
Anyway, so the point being that the issue being is it was about discrediting unions, so that people would turn around and say, well, why would I join a union? They're crooks. They're after themselves. When indeed the very people that we in the unions have criticised are those crooks that are after themselves from the big side of town. So I think it's been. It's clearly an ideologically driven agenda, and it is clearly about removing the voices for the ordinary people.
Yes,
and
indeed.
it's happened in other ways too, which we mustn't forget about. So one of the first things that Abbott did when he came in was close down a whole lot of advisory bodies which provide valuable information to ministers to help them make good policy decisions. Now we've got ministers having to rely on private consultants, which is all too frequent, and what's left of the public service. And of course that's been dramatically cut back also. So the effect is to actually weaken the whole structure of government, to weaken its capacity to speak up on behalf of people who aren't powerful enough to take their own voice to government or in the community, and to diminish the quality of governance of Australia generally.
Yes, and that's a raging concern, because I mean we can liken ourselves to other dictatorships of other nations that we frowned upon. We did their conduct, particularly as they've trashed their people and tried to crush people's rights. We have the same government, it appears, that's operative here in this country, and certainly the very reason why there's been strong opposition community-wide against Mr Abbott himself and his extreme right policies. But again, too, the Turnbull government are certainly supporting the very self-same policies. But the big concern within the unions and certainly with the workers is that you've got 10 million workers, and they're a huge wealth to the nation. But they're driven by a dictatorship type leadership that is going to start to push for greater progress and less, that is productivity they call it, and then less wages and less conditions. We then are going to end up in some sort of Stasi type situation. And we're seeing that people will be too fearful to operate. They'll be subjected to, particularly with the ABC coming into place, and the maintenance of the ABC, and even possibly the extension of the ABCC across the board is what really concerns us, because that really needs to be nipped in the bud. There's no need for that, and it really is like a Stasi-style police on the workers. It's like a worker police. Now, that's the very thing that we don't need, and we don't need these other bigger systems of government that you're talking about and the concerns within it, the lay within it, and particularly the user pay, the corporate control on those elements that have been privatised, so to them and into their hands. So I think we're going to work very strongly toward removing privatisation, cancelling the contracts of privatisation, really getting corporations really out of the situation, putting a restrictor and a restraint on them. And I think that your idea that you said about the National Corruption Commission, yes, that would certainly start to put a lot of constraint into place, and with politicians in public office as well as corporations, as well as some of the those corporations that have been operating illegally and dysfunctionally. But at the same time too, we need to actually push them out of the places of governance and governance itself.
And out of the political election funding as well.
Yes.
Because what is a real concern for Australia is that we haven't followed other countries like Britain and Canada, for example, where there are now very tight controls over who can donate to political parties and how much they can donate. So in Canada, for example, it's a cap of, I think, $1,200 per year per donor to anyone. So it doesn't matter whether they're making 6 donations, each of $200, or they're making one donation of $1,200. There's that $1,200 cap on the donations that they can make. Now there is public funding, but the public funding in fact is less than the public funding that's provided to political parties in Australia, where they get both public funding and private donations. So there's a real corruption in the way in which our electoral system is operating here. The other thing that applies it also applies in New South Wales, not just in Canada and Britain, is a cap on election spending, again, which makes it much fairer to all parties and all candidates. So it means, for example, that if you had someone very wealthy like Malcolm Turnbull or Donald Trump, then they couldn't buy their way into power by spending more on the election. They would have to keep within the cap on expenditure. So there's a whole lot of corrupt practices like that around our system in Australia, except in the state of New South Wales, where they have made reforms. And that's an area that we really ought to be moving on very quickly. One of the opportunities we've got, in fact, to take some action on it is what's called the Open Government Partnership, which was signed up just last November. The Turnbull signed up after Abbott had refused to, or had failed to. And the Open Government Partnership is an agreement amongst about 70 countries now that they are going to open up their government, make information freely available within their communities. And one of the components of that could be cleaning up our election system here in Australia, so that there are caps and bans on spending and on donations, and it would become a lot fairer to all parties and all candidates.
Yes, indeed, and I think it would be a better suggestion than the legislation at the moment, which it could trigger a double dissolution, which is the attack on crossbenchers and independent representatives. So that should bring some fair play into it, and also to start to, particularly if there's a cap, everyone's going to be equal. So we need an equal playing field. That's really going to start to eliminate those with the big money that can buy their way.
Well, I think there's far too much preparedness of people to just accept that people and the big parties who are in Parliament are there. Yeah, that parties sure are there and they've got their own agendas, but that parliamentarians may well be there just to look after their own interests, and that people accept that's okay, is, I think, part of the problem. And people should be a whole lot more demanding of the quality of the people that we elect to our parliaments.
Yes,
and I suppose what I'm saying there is that people should be and should have the opportunities to be a whole lot more involved in questioning who's standing their local candidates, how those candidates are selected by the parties, all of those sorts of things, which people by and large don't have anything to do with. We have very low membership of political parties, and then a sort of just a huge level of inertia and acceptance of, well, that's just the way it is. And yet people are very ready to complain about things. And I suppose, as someone involved in trade unions, and I've clearly been involved in other organisations and activist organisations, is that I suppose what one's always looking for is ways that would get other people to be more passionate about wanting to change things, rather than just focus on criticising them, or the bane of my life at the moment, just sharing them on Facebook, which has not changed the world.
No, well, however, change is occurring. We can see that there was mass change over the 2014 budget. There's mass reaction here in Australia, and we saw Mr Abbott, of course, his popularity dropped. There would have been 7.5% in the polls, which caused the change of leadership. He lost the Prime Ministership.
Which does show, doesn't it? Because people did rise up
against
people of all sorts of different political persuasions, people who voted for them, people who didn't. And so you had people coming and rallying and coming to meetings together that didn't even know they had things in common, and learned about things. And that's the sort of vibrant political community that we'd like.
Yes, precisely, and that's occurring now. I think as we look at the polls, and perhaps our last comments might be on this topic. But certainly the election coming up. 2016 is a very important time. The federal election is critical. We know that it's very important to the Liberal National Conservative government. We know that they may well be a one-term government. And there's a lot at stake. They certainly want control of the upper house. We've seen the mass battle that's ensued with those crossbenchers in the upper house. We've seen from 2014 to 15, we've seen a lot of, as you outlined today, Jeannie, a lot of the public sector policy salvaged from the claws and clutches of, I think, the big corporations, as they've been protected by the Turnbull government. So therefore, the fight back is critical. And now, as we see, Ken, with perhaps your final comment here, 50-50 drawn in the polls now. We've seen a decline in the polls of the popularity of Mr Turnbull. We're still heading into a headwind of an election. We don't know the precise date. We've got a budget coming up. How are we envisaging some of the conclusions? How is the stage going to be set here?
Well, I think the government is actually still in a lot of turmoil, and if they do decide they want to go for a double dissolution, it's actually going to be a very difficult thing to win, because they're effectively starting the campaign now. We've had the Prime Minister in South Australia this week campaigning to try and save seats in South Australian seats in the federal parliament. and he's got to sustain that sort of campaigning right through until the budget, and then from the budget there's still another several weeks before the double dissolution election, if that's to occur on the 2nd of July. So it's in fact very difficult to sustain a campaign over such a long period, and Bob Hawke nearly lost an election in 1984 trying to do exactly that. So
and they did say that Julia Gillard shouldn't have announced her campaign with so much notice to it. So there's a lot of comparisons here,
well,
isn't there?
There certainly are, and I think that Turnbull is already rattled and is in really serious danger of the coalition losing government, particularly if there is a double dissolution on the election on the 2nd of July.
Yes, and they're in threat of losing government. What do you think, Jeannie, is your final comment just regards the policies?
I hope Ken's right.
There's no policies on the table.
No, I hope Ken's right, because the policies that are on the table are dreadful, and the things that they want to put on the table are not giving us any joy either. So I think that they are a pretty rotten government in terms of governance, as you've been talking about, Ken. But their policies are policies which are to benefit those that are already advantaged. And we haven't even talked much about it, but the whole way they're looking at tax is about reinforcing privilege,
exactly,
rather than actually trying to even out, and the job of government is around redistribution. They've totally forgotten that's one of the points. In fact, I suppose their view is pull government out of things which and let the market rule, except they don't really believe that, because if you're going to have laissez-faire capitalism, well then you would actually allow unions to go about their business. So they do like regulating some things and they like paying for some things, but what they don't like paying for is for health and education, so or just ordinary folk can get medical assistance, get a decent education, live a decent life, and they don't care about it. And I think that's that, they don't care, and that's the only conclusion I can come to.
Well, we know who does care, and that's the public, and the public haven't had their say yet. They're going to have their say at the polls, and it's all in their hands, and we've seen governments tumble and governments fall. It's in the hands of the public, and we need to have public policy, and policy that's going to benefit the majority and in a equal way, and not in some glut to one corner of those that are already rich and exceeding their brief. I want to thank you very much indeed for joining me today. Jeannie Rea, thank you for your contribution, and Dr. Ken Coghill, thank you.
Thank you.
Viewers, for more information, subscribe to Sharon Fibres on the YouTube channel.